Say something else again, just to be sure. No, that's good. I think we're good now. Yeah, Aaron, you're good.
All right, guys, I think I'm gonna go ahead and get started here. I hope everybody can hear me. Okay, awesome. So I'm gonna go ahead and get started. The reason I decided to present on propaganda for this webinar is because all of us know America's fighting a misinformation war. I mean, between the upcoming election in November, like the outright fictitious news coverage of Black Lives Matter that pushes false narratives of like seemingly ceaseless looting and rioting, to fear mongering from politicians from both parties, it's like all over the airwaves all the time. All of us know we're fighting a misinformation war. So propaganda is the most effective way of spreading misinformation in human history. It's the most powerful tool of psychological coercion ever invented, like, beyond a doubt. Propaganda is so powerful that it has been historically used to build momentum for oppressive authoritarian regimes and manufacture the consent of societies to do things that seem unthinkable to the average person. From convincing millions of people to volunteer to fight in foreign wars, to straight up ethnic cleansing, to just all manner of totally unthinkable things. I'm going to cut off my camera while I go ahead with the PowerPoint. Okay. So this presentation is going to answer 4 questions. The first one is, what is propaganda? And we'll go over the goal or purpose of propaganda and how it manufactures consent. And then we'll look at some examples of American propaganda from history and from modern times. And what counts as modern American propaganda may surprise you. And then as part 1 of what is propaganda, we'll go over how propaganda actually works and what it does, and what it seeks to accomplish and why fascists love it. So part 2 will be on why propaganda is so effective. What actual method or process does propaganda use to reach every member of a society? And again, the answers may be surprising. And then for parts 3 and 4, we'll go over how propaganda has been used by fascistic regimes in history to accomplish unbelievable feats. And lastly, answer the question of where fascist propaganda is actually coming from now and how the American left can maybe fight back. All right. So to start us off, I would like it if the people in the chat could answer 2 questions for me. So the first one is, what is propaganda? Give me some examples of what you think propaganda is. And then the second question is, what does propaganda do? What's the goal of propaganda? Also, I cannot figure out how to look at the chat, so please post it in the question and answer page. Okay, yeah, propaganda is often art. Amazing answer, thank you for that. Politically charged art and words, changes opinions, all excellent answers. How a powerful entity controls the narrative. Yes, correct. Okay, you can see that I'm sitting in a group of very educated leftists. All right. So I'll go ahead with this presentation. So we got such great answers off the bat. So the truth is, the previous slide that I just showed you is a combination of text and an image that is propaganda in and of itself. So the image and text I just showed on the previous slide, it was straight up propaganda. I asked a question, but also showed an image that I suspected would influence the answers in a direction that is desirable for the purposes of my presentation. All right. So this is a quote by Joseph Goebbels. I think I'm saying that right. But propaganda works best on those who are being manipulated when they are confident they're acting of their own free will. So Joseph Goebbels was the minister of propaganda during Nazi Germany. Here he's identified that the main objective of propaganda is to convince the person being manipulated that he or she is acting of their own free will. So to answer the question of what propaganda is in a little more detail, it's basically, it gets an involuntary agent to commit a voluntary act that's in line with the agenda that propaganda has sold to them. So this is a quote from Aristotle that illustrates how propaganda is psychological coercion. And in his book, On Element of Choice and Voluntariness, he says, what sort of acts then should be called compulsory? We answered that without qualification, actions are so when the cause is in the external circumstances and the agent contributes nothing. So Aristotle's statement makes it clear that the essence of psychological coercion is being caused by an external agent. Like, it's opposition not only to the individual's internal process of decision-making, which distinguishes actions that are truly voluntary, but also is the spontaneity common to all of nature. Aristotle gives some instances of physical coercion, a man blown from his path by the wind and a man carried away by kidnappers, to give a few examples. So, to put that in context, propaganda is like being carried away by a psychological kidnapper. We know that psychological forces can also bring about coercion. For example, the movements commanded of a person when they are hypnotized have an external origin in the will of the hypnotist. The hypnotized person contributes nothing by way of voluntary decision to those movements. The hypnotized person is an instrument moved by the external force of the hypnotist's will. The hypnotists in modern times are the operators of the propaganda machines that all of us are familiar with. So this is a quote by Karl Marx. It's one of my favorites. It says that art is always and everywhere the secret confession and at the same time the immortal movement of its time, which is why I like the answers in the second slide of what propaganda is. Everybody already knows that propaganda is art. That the oldest and maybe the most successful form of propaganda is visual art. Why so? Because it has an emotional impact. As they say, a picture's worth 1,000 words. So with that said, let's talk about the word picture association that a lot of people in America have with the word propaganda that they learned about in history class in high school. This image of Uncle Sam on the left is very historically significant. In part 2, why propaganda is so effective, I'll elaborate on why propaganda is functionally the same thing as a meme, but bear with me for now. So the American government understood that memes transmit information to cultures during World War I and mass-produced these recruitment posters to put up in public spaces. But this image of Uncle Sam is the most historically significant event in the evolution of American propaganda because it was so highly effective and it created multiple frightening patterns. The image of Uncle Sam saying, "I want you for the U.S. Army," caused unprecedented numbers of young men to line up to volunteer to fight and die in a foreign war. The artist who drew it, James Montgomery Flagg, was rocketed to fame and commissioned by the government to draw 46 more posters just like this one. So to truly understand the history of this image, it's important to think about the artist's intentions as part of a comprehensive analysis. Propaganda targets all levels of a society, but it's overwhelmingly more targeted at groups of people who have symbolic power and social capital. And it's targeted at those people because they have the best potential to be turned into productive servants of an oppressor class. Now, thinking about this, both of these groups in this dynamic are white men. A white man drew this poster and the intention of the drawing is clearly predatory in nature. So before James Montgomery Flagg's image of Uncle Sam existed, the cartoonist who had drawn the most popular versions of Uncle Sam was a guy named Thomas Nash. His drawings were more cartoonish and stylized and showed a kind of folksy, Miyazaki-esque older dude that rode around on snails and was not remotely predatory. Now bear in mind that Uncle Sam both of these artists were drawing was based on the same person. Uncle Sam was actually a real cultural icon of American patriotism, based on a guy named Sam Wilson. Sam Wilson was a self-starter butcher, the meat inspector for the Union Army, and likely pretty rich. So when Franklin Delano Roosevelt asked Flagg what his inspiration was, he responded that he had depicted himself. Roosevelt patted him on the back and congratulated him on saving money on a model for the artwork that was responsible for countless numbers of soldiers dying overseas. How's that for the suicidality of American individualism? The key differences between the artist's intentions behind these two images drawn of the same character from history are very important. So this is a quote from Fyodor Kropotkin that I really enjoy. And I hope my anarchist friends in the audience will like this quote. It shows very clearly why Flagg's predatory image of Uncle Sam pointing is not good for organized society. The practice of solidarity is the only thing that can interrupt the American narrative of rugged individualism. So to go back to Nash's drawing, this image clearly is not optimized to capitalize on anything in the keyword inventory of stern, authoritative, muscular, predatory white man who orders all patriots to go to war. Nash's image shows a kind of Walden-esque woodsy frontiersman, and while it's debatable whether this image is propaganda or not, it certainly did not mobilize scores of young men to show up and die for Uncle Sam. Flagg's deadly Uncle Sam propaganda targeted stern, young, muscular, authoritative Yankee men in order to encourage them to enlist for the American Army. So, like I said before, American propaganda targets all levels of its society and has classically done so, like with wartime posters that targeted women to influence them to find work in production jobs to back up the war effort. That propaganda was certainly harmful as well. But I assert the most demonstrably deadly propaganda in the history of this nation that has resulted in more cumulative lives lost over time was this image of Uncle Sam that targets young white male nationalists who do two things. One, possess the most symbolic power and social capital, and two, paints Uncle Sam as someone just like them, but better and with more authority. So, talking about patriots, it's important to answer the question of who's really a patriot in the context of American history. Flagg's image of Uncle Sam manufactured American society's consent to perceive patriots as young white nationalists listening to authoritarian wisdom. Flagg's reimagined image of Uncle Sam saying, "I choose you," established that the most accurate visual representation of the American state is this Uncle Sam character, a muscular and stern white man, and that he chooses muscular and stern younger white men to fight for him. Because of this effect on the class consciousness of America, radical leftists, and especially black leftists, have been precluded for 100 years from being perceived as patriotic citizens. It has utterly crippled American organized labor and resulted in a century of major political losses, as well as obstructed the civil rights movement in every way imaginable. So to go back to this image of Uncle Sam, once the American government saw how effective the combination of this image and text was, you can bet they launched every single scientist at their disposal to analyze it. Those astute scientists figured out why it was so effective, and then propaganda in America was frighteningly optimized forever. American propaganda has continued to get more and more advanced and complex for the past century, following the precedents that this image set for what is good propaganda, that targets a generation of young men to be lured into the military-industrial complex and then kills them at the same time so the state has no aging veterans to socially support. So here we have another Marx quote. "The alienation of man thus appeared as the fundamental evil of capitalist society." The history of the Uncle Sam art reveals this fundamental evil that Marx is talking about, the alienation of all mankind. The Uncle Sam art alienates and pits young white men against the rest of American society and also lures them into the military-industrial complex. So for part two, we're going to answer the question, why is propaganda so effective? In this section, we're going to explore some examples of modern American propaganda and show how it is functionally the same thing as a meme. All of us are familiar with memes. And what do memes do? They duplicate a reality. So this quote by Edward Bernays substitutes the example of a rubber stamp for what I am calling a meme. Universal literacy was supposed to educate the common man to control his environment. Once he could read and write, he would have a mind fit to rule. So ran the democratic doctrine. But instead of a mind, universal literacy has given him rubber stamps inked with advertising slogans, with editorials, with published scientific data, with the trivialities of the tabloids and the platitudes of history, but quite innocent of original thought. Each man's rubber stamps are the duplicates of millions of others, so that when those millions are exposed to the same stimuli, all receive identical imprints. It may seem an exaggeration to say that the American public gets most of its ideas in this wholesale fashion. The mechanism by which ideas are disseminated on a large scale is propaganda in the broad sense of an organized effort to spread a particular belief or doctrine. So the logical next question is, what beliefs or doctrines are being sold to Americans in the realities of the media that we consume? So, like I just established, propaganda is so effective because it duplicates reality. In this section, we're going to look at two Marvel superheroes and how their respective mythological or superhuman attributes duplicate a reality that is highly desirable to the American state: Captain America and the Punisher. And throughout this section, you'll notice I only show images of Captain America. And that's because Steve Rogers is a good guy who was unfortunately bastardized to be imperialist propaganda. I only show images of him because I'm memeing him as good praxis. Frank Castle, the Punisher, is not a good guy, and so his face doesn't get any real estate in my presentation. All right, so Captain America is a man named Steve Rogers. Steve Rogers was a scrawny, young, white art student growing up during the Great Depression. His alcoholic father died when Steve was a child, and his mother passed away from pneumonia. In the early 1940s, appalled at Nazi Germany's horrific atrocities, Steve attempted to enlist in the army, but failed to pass the physical requirements. Steve was then invited to volunteer for Operation Rebirth, a project intended to enhance U.S. soldiers to the height of physical perfection where he could feasibly combat Nazis. Obviously, this reinforces the cultural narrative created by the Uncle Sam propaganda. And on the slide, we've got a quote from Wikipedia that literally says, Captain America was designed as a patriotic super soldier who often fought the Axis powers of World War II and was Timely Comics' most popular character during the wartime period. Captain America is literally the perfect case-in-point victim of the Uncle Sam propaganda. He's a scrawny young white man who is optimized by the American state and turned into a super soldier who kills Nazis. All right. So let's talk about some of the superhuman attributes Captain America receives after Steve Rogers, a sensitive art student, has been turned into a super soldier. First up is Captain America's shield. The symbolism of Captain America's shield is absolutely self-evident imperialist propaganda. Anything that Captain America does in a fight, no matter how heinous or violent, is necessarily an act of self-defense, because his weapon is not a weapon but a shield. It's quite brilliant propaganda. So these are just some suggestions to consider what the Captain American character, narrative, and superhuman attributes could have possibly manufactured American society's consent to do or accept over time. Some examples being confusing the murder of civilians with acts of police self-defense, confusing violent war crimes with acts of self-defense, volunteering to participate in foreign wars, and discarding the humanities and public education. So to go back to the quote on the first Captain America slide, fascism is the tools of imperialism turned inward. Whether or not you believe Captain America is imperialist propaganda, it remains clear. The citizens of the United States of America have been deceived by propaganda over time to believe that the murders of civilians at home and abroad are the American state acting in self-defense. So let's look at the Punisher. The Punisher symbol has been appropriated by multiple factions of far-right extremists. It's a straight-up fascist meme. It's no coincidence that the Punisher symbol has been appropriated by the likes of Blue Lives Matter and QAnon because it suits their agendas. And it's easy to see why when you look at the character of the Punisher, Frank Castle. The Punisher is a man named Frank Castle. His character is quite a bit darker than Steve Rogers. Frank Castle is a Sicilian-American vigilante whose crime-fighting tactics include torture, murder, kidnapping, guerrilla warfare, and coercion. He has a tragic past. His wife and 2 children were killed by the mob, and this drives and, more importantly, legitimizes his actions in his brutal campaign for justice. Frank Castle is an entitled, remorseless, and manipulative man. And you'll notice that many of these characteristics I've just outlined fit right into the dark triad of personality traits, which is common among cops. Again, it's no coincidence that fascists have appropriated the Punisher symbol to suit the agendas of multiple far-right extremist groups. Fascist propaganda duplicates the false reality, and the legitimacy of the Punisher character being a particularly dark, violent, and brutal superhero who executes his enemies is no coincidence at all. So, as for the story of the Punisher character, the man who conceived of the Punisher character, Jerry Conway, described his inspiration in an interview from 1987. I was fascinated by the Don Pendleton executioner character, which was fairly popular at the time, and I wanted to do something that was inspired by that, although not to my mind a copy of it. And while I was doing the Jackal storyline, the opportunity came for a character who would be used by the Jackal to make Spider-Man's life miserable. The Punisher seemed to fit. So, the Punisher is an executioner who is used to make Spider-Man a verifiable working-class hero whose motto is, with great power comes great responsibility, miserable. Of note, the Jackal, who sends this unhinged, militarized cop, executioner, the Punisher, after Spider-Man, is a genocidal maniac whose evil agenda is to kill everyone and resurrect his dead girlfriend. Make of that what you will. So now let's look at how the Punisher logo has been used in the media. The Punisher logo is repeatedly memed in the movie American Sniper, and if you have not seen it, I don't recommend it. The Punisher logo is memed throughout the movie American Sniper, and because of this, it has been memed even further by the US military. American Sniper is a dramatized documentary about the life of Chris Kyle, the deadliest sniper in the history of the US military, who has killed a grand total of 160 people last I checked. Chris Kyle has stated that he does not regret this in the slightest, and that he believes he has made significant contributions to the fight against terrorism over the course of 5 tours in Iraq. Chris Kyle was a high-ranking officer of Navy SEAL Team 3. The Punisher logo was the logo of Navy SEAL Team 3 in real life. The image on the left of the slide is a real shirt you can buy online. The Punisher is a prime example of how carceral logic is used to socially justify mass incarceration. Carceral logic is a logic of punishment that says incarceration or punishment is a suitable means to rehabilitate bad members of society. The Punisher symbol is clearly a complex symbol of carceral logic which has been used to socially justify the violence of American cops and the American military over time. Without a doubt, the Punisher character and the Punisher logo have been used to seed carceral logic into the minds of Americans. The Punisher symbol is very powerful propaganda that enforces the logical system of punishing bad members of society to protect the American status quo and social order. So for part 3, we're going to talk about how propaganda has been used in the past. But before we launch into part 3, let's talk about what a meme actually is. The man who coined the term meme is an ethologist, evolutionary biologist, and author named Richard Dawkins. For those who are unfamiliar, Dawkins is a bit of a problematic person who does not deserve his notoriety, but nonetheless he coined the term meme, and so we will use his definition. Dawkins believes that human evolution depended not on the particular basis of genetics, but on the existence of a self-replicating unit of transmission, which is the gene. For Dawkins, memes were another self-replicating unit that functioned just like a gene. So here's some imagery to help you wrap your mind around how and why propaganda, which is just like memes, is so astonishingly effective in manufacturing the consent of societies to accept unthinkable horrors. Propaganda is a gene. Propaganda is so powerful, it is like genetically manipulating a culture and influencing its evolution. And as such, it's fitting to say that Adolf Hitler is the #1 meme lord ever. So this is a quote by Hitler. "The receptivity of the masses is very limited, their intelligence is small, but their power of forgetting is enormous. In consequence of these facts, all propaganda must be limited to a very few points and must harp on these in slogans until the last member of the public understands what you want him to understand by your slogan." Is this ringing any bells? So let's think about the slogan, "Make America Great Again," for a moment. It's limited to 3 points. 1, America has been great before. 2, America's fallen glory must be restored. And 3, America is not as great as it has been right now. So thinking about how Hitler socially justified the extermination of Jewish people to the German public, he blamed the lasting economic devastation caused by the former World War on Jewish people. Then he claimed the glory of Germany could be restored by getting rid of the problem. Then he drove home his solution to this problem over and over in simple, repeatable slogans, how horrible Germany was with Jewish people in it. So, repeated and simple slogans used as propaganda are so effective because of something called the illusory truth effect. The illusory truth effect works thus. We all have a tendency to believe something is true after being exposed to it multiple times, and this has been proven in a bunch of studies. The more times we've heard something, the truer it begins to seem. The effect of the illusory truth is so powerful that repetition can persuade us to believe information we knew to be false in the past. On the right, you can see a very harmful and racist image of a caricatured Jewish man sitting atop a mound of skulls. Even though German society rationally knew Jewish people were not actually committing genocide, images like this convinced the entire German society that Jewish people were the real killers and thus deserved imprisonment and eventually genocide. The illusory truth effect is the reason why advertising works at all, and why propaganda is one of the most powerful tools ever invented for controlling how and what the masses think. So, though the true death toll is impossible to know because the Nazis destroyed evidence near the end of the war, Hitler is estimated by a 2017 Washington Post article to have killed a staggering 11 million people during the Holocaust. All of us learned in school how horrific this event was, but it defies most of our imaginations how this was possible. It was possible because of simple and repeatable slogans. Slogans that exploited people's fears and insecurities and their perception of instability in the German status quo. The Nazis fired up their propaganda machine by advocating clear, simple messages tailored to a broad range of people and their problems. The propaganda aimed to exploit collective fears and feelings of uncertainty and social instability. These messages frequently portrayed Nazi ideals regarding women, children, and the nuclear family. The text of this image on the left reads, "Women, millions of men without work, millions of children without a future. Save the German family. Vote for Adolf Hitler." I suppose you could rephrase, "Make Germany great again." So the last question we're going to answer is, where is modern propaganda coming from? The quote on this slide is from John Baudrillard's brilliant book, Simulation and Simulacra, which breaks the order of the meaning of symbols into 4 stages of evolution in the history of a society. Without going into too much very philosophical detail about symbology and sign order, let me assure you that in the digital age, we are very probably at the 4th and final stage of Baudrillard's evolution of meaning. Baudrillard's 4th stage is pure simulacrum or imitation. In this stage, images in the media around us have very little or no relationship to material reality. Here in Baudrillard's 4th stage of the evolution of the meaning of signs and symbols, signs merely reflect other older imitations of reality, in any claim to factual present material reality on the part of the images or signs is mere duplication. So to put this in context, we're living in a culture where the cultural products like news and the news media need no longer even pretend to be real, because the experiences of consumers' lives are so predominantly artificial in the first place that even claims to reality are expected to be phrased in artificial, hyper-real terms that the people understand. So in the digital age, satirically called the age of information, we're living in a very hyper-real world of superheroes and a largely fictitious marketplace of ideas that is often quite disconnected from material history or reality. In the digital age, the goal of propaganda has shifted. It's shifted away from selling untruths, like the Nazis sold to the German public about Jewish people ruining the economy and the nuclear family, to making the truth not matter at all, by flooding the public mind with ideas and concepts. The point of modern American propaganda is not to make people believe it. It is to destroy claims to truth. It's to create such cynicism in the public conscience, we don't know what to believe. We slowly come to believe that nothing is true. No facts are reliable, and the world is simply a battlefield of partisan ideas. In essence, the point of modern American propaganda is to make us believe the news is fake. In the graphic on this slide, we can see how the acronym CNN has been seamlessly adapted to suit multiple partisan agendas. No matter how absurd or tenuous the connection is between the partisan ideas, Chinese News Network and Clinton News Network, adherents of Fox News propaganda accept it because they have been so completely bamboozled by propaganda. So this is a quote by Carl Sagan that I love. One of the saddest lessons of history is this: if we've been bamboozled long enough, we tend to reject any evidence of the bamboozle. We're no longer interested in finding out the truth. The bamboozle has captured us. It's simply too painful to acknowledge, even to ourselves, that we've been taken. So I like this quote because it shows how once propaganda has successfully manufactured the consent of an individual to uncritically accept its agenda, they have given away their personal power of internal decision-making to the bamboozle of a false reality. Once someone has been taken away by what Sagan calls the bamboozle, it's very difficult for them to be brought back to reality, because admitting how wrong they were in the first place is simply too painful for their conscious mind. So to corroborate Sagan's observations on how a quote-unquote bamboozle may destroy an individual mind, here's a quote from Hannah Arendt about the insidious goal of totalitarian public education. The aim of totalitarian education has never been to instill convictions, but to destroy the capacity to form any. Hannah Arendt was a German-American thinker whose books and articles have had a lasting influence on political theory. She's widely considered one of the most important political thinkers of the 20th century. Arendt understood that when facts are denied and substituted by lies or fake news, the result is, in her words, an absolute refusal to believe in the truth of anything, no matter how well this truth may be established. Such cynicism, she argues, is the true goal of totalitarian regimes. The aim of totalitarian education has never been to instill convictions. So, in view of all this, what should the left do? How can we begin to win the misinformation war? How can we assert ourselves as the party of truth and humanity? And on the bottom half of the slide, I've got some suggestions about how we might do that, which are conveniently corroborated by some other brilliant presentations that we've heard today. So I'll conclude with another quote from Edward L. Bernays, who, by the way, is Sigmund Freud's nephew. Truth is mighty and must prevail, and if any body of men believes that they have discovered a valuable truth, it is not merely their privilege, but their duty to disseminate that truth. If they realize, as they quickly must, that this spreading of truth can be done upon a large scale and effectively only by organized effort, They will make use of the press and the platform as the best means to give it wide circulation. Propaganda becomes vicious and reprehensive only when its authors consciously and deliberately disseminate what they know to be lies, or when they aim at effects which they know to be prejudicial to the common good. So, in conclusion, propaganda is not evil. Propaganda is only evil when the operators of the propaganda machine are, in Fyodor Kropotkin's timeless words, individuals endowed with predatory inclinations, which the left is not. And thank you for listening, everybody.
Awesome, awesome, awesome. Thank you so much, Aaron. That was very enlightening and amazing. And I always appreciate any opportunity for someone to talk about comics in the lens of the current socio-political landscape. Uh, so especially the relation to the Punisher as a character and his symbology and association with the fascist far-right movements. Yeah, including even the kind of hyper reality or the evolution of propagandizing and kind of mimetic imagery. Thinking in the lens of memes specifically, we all kind of know the evolution of a meme, right? It's like you see the picture and the joke and you're like, what is this? I don't really get it. And then you see it more and you get the formula, and then it starts to cross over with other memes to combine these abstract kind of images, jokes, ideas, to the point to where you're now just looking at kind of nonsense imagery and still following the idea of what it represents without it saying anything or depicting anything of meaning outside of that specific context. Yeah, so that was my long-winded way of saying, yeah, I see how memes relate to propaganda, and thanks for that. So next up, we have production. Andrew Jackson and the Rise of Fascism in America. That's going to be presented by Brother Nate. There we go. Just wanted to make sure he was available there. All right, comrade, I'll let you take it from here.
Yeah, y'all got to forgive me. I don't have my computer, and the only other thing I have my basis on is my phone, so I'm gonna have to go off video. All right, but